be prepared. Right, this is a masterclass webinar that we prepared on E. coli, Escherichia coli, O157, H7, Varg type 8. It's still one of the lowest infective dose of foodborne diseases in the UK. So it's a foodborne disease, it's not food poisoning. And it can be as few, officially it's as few as 10 organisms can make you ill. But scientists reckon that it can be as few as a single bacteria. So it's very important that you get this right. This webinar will help you to understand why there's been a significant interest in this particular organism and help you find a way of managing it. So the range we're using Keynote, not PowerPoint, but it's the same sort of thing. The range is a background to bacteria, the history of E. coli or coliforms, the morphology of E. coli 157, the actual incidence of it, the sources, control measures, and hand hygiene. At the end of this session, we'll be able to list and describe the main sources of E. coli 157, together with the knowledge to effectively control the spread of this disease. When I worked at Twidos, we found out that Rowntree's originally, in their factories in the 60s and 70s, did random hand tests, hand washing tests. So when people went to the toilets, they would do random samples and swabs on their hands. And if they came back and they got coliforms or E. coli on the hands, it was instant dismissal. Because what it proved was they hadn't washed their hands. So even going back 40, 50 years ago, people were doing that. Bacteria are very small single-cell protozoa. That's the animal kingdom, rather than yeast, which is vegetable kingdom. They're approximately 2 to 3 microns across, and you need either an oil immersion lens microscope to see them at around 3,000 magnification, which is on the bottom left of the screen. Or if you need more detail, you need something like an electron scanning microscope. And although those are in colour, the electron scanning microscope doesn't put them in colour, those are computer generated images. There are millions of different types of bacteria on the planet. They're very diverse, and some can survive very extreme environments. A few will cause foodborne illness, including food poisoning and foodborne disease. This is a typical cell structure of the E. coli bacterium. And basically, you've got the flagellae, which are means of the bacteria swimming through the substance they're in. They've got the cell membrane, which is the cell wall. You've got the cytoplasm, which is the contents of the cell. And your cell membrane stops the bacteria leaching out stuff and prevents other stuff coming in. Then you've got the DNA at the center of this. So that's a typical bacterial cell. Growth requirements of bacteria in general, you need time. Effectively, for bacteria to reproduce, they reproduce by binary fission every 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the conditions that they require. They need the right temperature to grow. So you can get actually it says psychrophiles, but it's psychrotrophs. There are no psychrophilic pathogens, only sponge organisms. You've got mesophiles and you've got thermophiles. So psychrophiles prefer the cooler end of the scale, mesophiles in the middle, and thermophiles prefer hot temperatures. You then they've got to have water the same as any living thing. So that is measured by AW, or water activity. They've got to have nutrients. So these are things that typically with E. coli, it's things like beef, venison, lamb, etc. The pH or the acidity of the substance that the bacteria found in will effectively help control them. So something that is lower than 3.5 pH will kill them off. And the top end of the scale is about 6.5 or 7.5, I think is the top end. Then they also need the right atmosphere. So you've got aerobic, anaerobic, or microaerophilic. In ideal conditions, bacteria, as we said, multiply by dividing into two every 10 to 20 minutes. This is called asexual reproduction, and it's known as binary fission. So you start off with a parent cell on the left, and that then splits into two, and then you have got two daughter cells. That's a video of binary fission. And it just shows that we start with two, and after a very, it's a speed up version, but in a very, very quick period of time, you end up getting millions. Identification of individual strains of bacteria is a highly specialized job, and a variety of methods are used to do this, including things like selective media on petri dishes. So you've got various, you've got your normal bog standard blood agar, which will grow all sorts of bacteria. Then you've got other ones which will help you grow things like E. coli, etc. Bacteria. Serotyping is used to subclassify an individual species of bacteria. For example, there are thousands of serotypes of Salmonella, i.e. Salmonella enteritis, Salmonella goccos, etc. And it's usually named after the person that found it or the place it was found. An antigen is a molecule that reacts with an antibody. Serotyping depends on testing the organism's reaction with the many different antibodies to determine which antigens are present. Based on the detection of antigens, a single species can be divided into hundreds of thousands of different serotypes. Rabbits are often used to produce the antiserum itself that's used in testing. So this is serotyping. So the E. coli O157, the O157 antigen is found there because it's clumped. If you can see, it's clumped rather than the control latex number 5, which is clear. And the H7 antigen is also clumped. So this is why it's got E. coli O157 H7, and that's where the name comes from. It's all due to the serotyping of the bacteria. Modified atmospheres. The advanced anoxamat is a microprocess control system for creating an anaerobic, microaerophilic, and chemiophilic environment in jars. This helps it extract the conditions that the bacteria require to grow. More often with things like what's the one that's microaerophilic? Is that is that Campylobacter, which is called a Campylobacter, and that requires a microaerophilic organism atmosphere. You've also got phage testing or phage typing, and it's a method used for detecting single strains of bacteria, and it's used to trace the source of outbreaks of infections. The viruses that infect bacteria are called bacteriophages, or phages for short, and some of these can only infect a single strain of bacteria. These phages are used to identify different strains of bacteria within a single species. So you can see the DNA. The thing with these viruses is they only replicate in living cells. So if you've got a cold or flu or E. coli, then the viruses have to inject the DNA into the cell where it multiplies. It then grows and creates hundreds of more viruses, and then it explodes the cell. So that is a computer-generated item of what happens to virus's DNA. You inject it into a living cell, and it allows the DNA to create multiple viruses. And you can test for phage typing by using the bacteria culture that you want to grow on agar and dried. A grid is drawn on the base of the Petri dish to mark out different regions. And the different regions are then inoculated. So each grid has a different phage or different bacteria phage. The phage drops are allowed to dry and are incubated. The susceptible phage regions will show circular clearing where the bacteria have been lysed or killed, and this is used in differentiate. So phage type 8 is a particular bacteriophage, and it's used for to identify. Professor Hugh Pennington, obviously now long retired, he got into the initial inquiry of E. coli, and then later he led the public inquiry into the September 2005 outbreak of E. coli in O157 in South Wales in schools. And he came up with a set of recommendations which over the years have been implemented by health authorities. So, Escherichia coli O157 H7 phage type 8. So it's a rod-shaped organism, gram-negative, visually very similar to other E. coli bacteria. As we said, there are coliforms, and there are various subtypes or subtypes of E. coli. There are various ones that you've seen in newspapers. It's non-sporing, so it's easily killed by heat and effective disinfection. It also produces a virocytotoxin, which is a one that affects the kidneys. It has patricious flagellae, which project in all dimensions. So it's not like a flagella just on one side of the organism. These are all around the bacteria. So serotyping will find the O antigens on the cell surface, and the H antigens, or the flagellae, they're found on the surface of the flagellae. So that's why on the sample that we showed you, where there are inclusions on the serotyping, that's where you've got two different types. So that's O157 and H7. Some bacteria use these sort of API20E test strips. I don't know if they're used in E. coli, but these can be used with bacteriology in a path lab. Selected media. There are various culture plates which will help you identify whether you've got E. coli 157 or other E. colis. You've got another thing which helps you. I mean, the thing is, the numbers involved in E. coli are very small. With something like, as few as 10 bacteria officially being there. So the thing is, how do you grow enough bacteria and separate it out from other bacteria? Retriever helps you concentrate the number of E. coli 157 bacteria that are present in any given sample. Otherwise, it'd be virtually impossible to do it properly. And it's one of the reasons why it can take several days to actually confirm that is the cause of the foodborne disease outbreak. Because you've got to then, once you've got the suspended, the solution, you've then got to grow it again, and that normally takes overnight. So it can take several days to actually formally identify it. So, virocytotoxin is produced, and that's enterohemohagic. diarrhea and bloody diarrhea. That's hemolytic uremic syndrome, or HUS, is one of these symptoms, and thrombotic thrombopyasinic purpura, or TTP, is another. This can lead to long-term renal problems in a significant proportion of cases. So it could end up being kidney damage for the rest of your life, and death in about 5 to 30% of those people who develop HUS or TTP. You can also have asymptomatic carriage where no symptoms are showing, so it's very difficult to isolate your food handlers from handling food. So it's a very low infective dose, less than 10 bacteria, and it's thought that a single bacterium can cause the infection. The main problem is with cross-contamination from raw meats such as beef, lamb, venison, and unwashed vegetables onto ready-to-eat foods. So this was the 1996 butcher shop, John Barr, and they closed down, and they gave raw meat and cooked meats, sandwiches to nursing homes, and it caused around 400 cases and including 21 deaths. So that wasn't a good outbreak. And that's the first one that Professor Pennington was involved in. And then this guy, in 2005, he was a 5-year-old boy, and when he was eating school dinners, and again they'd been supplied with meats which had been contaminated with Ecoli, and Mason Jones ate gammon and turkey supplied by a local butcher only 2 weeks after switching from packed lunches. So that was a particularly sad case. Then you've also got these petting farms. So if you think about that, it's basically a poo or a feces, fecal-based bacteria, and you've got animals there, and you let the kids stroke the animals, and then they don't wash their hands, then you've got problems. And when I was doing the Harrogate Christmas market a few years ago, we had the reindeer from local markets, and they had to have a hand washing station. But the problem was the information that parents received. The parents didn't make sure the kids were washing their hands after they touched the reindeer, because it wasn't generally known in the general public. I know 93 cases, 76 were hospitalised, and 17 had HUS, or hemolytic uremic syndrome. There's been other cases, and there was a national outbreak in 2010, 2011, where there was 256 cases in all, 80 hospitalizations and 1 death. And at the time, they didn't know where it came from. And eventually, it wasn't publicized at the time because the origins of this wasn't known. But basically, they soon found out that it was things like raw potatoes, leeks, etc. Since then, there's been various other superbugs. So this was the Germany reports 200 new cases of the Ecoli 104. Now, look at that graph. What does that graph tell people? Anyone have any ideas?
I'm going to say barbecue season.
Yeah. And many barbecue season. And it's all to do with undercooking of burgers or steaks, and people using the tongs from the barbecue to handle the raw meat, and then without washing them or heat treating the utensils, using them for the cooked meat. Apologies. Beef and lamb carcasses contaminated during slaughter. So, as I said, E. coli is a gut organism. The minute you slaughter that animal and you eviscerate it or take the guts out, that causes the bacteria to spread to the outside of the meat. You've then got unpasteurized dairy products where, again, if you've got feces on the teats of the animals, then that'll cause it. You've got soil-bearing vegetables such as potatoes and leeks. You can find it in the environment, and people, person-to-person transmission. These are all sources of E. coli O157. So for yourself, the best thing is wash your hands. So, sources of raw meat. With burgers, you've got to get the low quality cuts, usually from the forequarters of the animal, and you mince it up. Now, when you mince it up, the outside of the meat, which is contaminated, goes on the inside of the beef burgers. Whereas something like a sirloin steak or a fillet steak or a rump steak, I will eat those rare. So just the outside's been flashed on the grill and the inside's all bloody and all the rest of it. But that's fine, because I've killed the bacteria off by searing it on the griddle. With beef burgers, they've got to be cooked. And it's no good if someone offers you a pink beef burger or a raw or undercooked one. It may be what the Americans like, but it's not safe to do so. And various people have been prosecuted for that. So, rare steak, fine. Undercooked beef burger, never. You've got raw veg and fruit. So, control measures for E. coli 157. Good quality ingredients, thorough cooking, effective cleaning and disinfection of food contact surfaces and food equipment, including sinks where veg has been washed. So, for example, you've got, if you've got something like a slicer or a mince machine, which is used for cooked stuff on one hand and raw on the other, unless you can prove that your cleaning and disinfection is adequate, then an environmental health officer will frown on that and ask you to have separate pieces of equipment. You've got then the prevention of cross-contamination, i.e. things like colour coding, different work surfaces, etc., etc. Correct refrigeration and date coding. Effective HACCP, or Safe Food Better Business, and having separate staff, i.e. butchers, manufacturing. Staff need to be trained. They've got to have good hand hygiene, and then you've got to have good design. So you need to have something which we call a continuous learning workflow. So dirty to clean or raw to cooked, and you shouldn't have any backtrack on that. It's very difficult to achieve a continuous learning workflow, but if you think it out and plan it, you can do that. 6-stage cleaning. This still isn't used. A video from Highfield, which I bought a few years ago, but very effective. So, this is what the local authority in Harrogate and their environmental health department looked at. So, they've got this so-called Pennington report a few years back, and the key points of the report were HACCP, or written systems with records, or Safe Food Better Business. And they said that staff training was fundamental. So for operatives, level 2, for head chefs, supervisors, level 3, and for management, a level 4 as well. And Harrogate's response was, at inspection, that management must get to grips with HACCP. So is your HACCP up to date? All staff must be trained and understand, and it must be implemented in practice. And that needs to have supporting documentation. So, cleaning and disinfections. Are the cleaning products appropriate? So, for disinfectants, you've got BSEN 1276, which came out in 1977. And then you've got BSEN 13697, which came out in 2001. The later one, the BSEN 13697, is a little bit more involved and more effective. 2-method cleaning, correct methods. Now, that's what people, the environmental health will always say it's a 2-method cleaning, but effectively that is the 6 stages that we're just showing you in the video. Contact time and dilution rates must be followed. Separate cloths, and they should always be disposable. You don't want colour-coded cloths. You want paper towel of food grade. You need to have a written schedule of cleaning. So at inspection, the officers will check the chemical dilution rates and the time, contact time, especially for disinfectants that's used. They will then ask the management how they clean. They'll actually ask the staff who are carrying out the job how they clean. They'll check if they've got separate single-use cloths. They'll do a visual inspection, and they'll check the cleaning inspection has been used as well. Cross-contamination, separate areas for raw meat and ready-to-eat foods. Complete, separate complex equipment, slices, backpackers, etc., and regular and effective hand washing, staff hygiene. So when Harrogate go in, they will check visually, they'll check that there is clear separation at all stages of production. They'll actually watch the staff to check that their hand washing is appropriate, and checks on complex equipment. And they will check the staff movements and that they've got clean overclothing on. So colour coding, etc., will all help. Key points of the report: thorough cooking to plus 75 degrees for 20 seconds, mincemeat, burgers, raw meats. And they will question the staff, check the temperatures in the records, and check the probe. So the HO might turn around and say, "Oh, can you show me how you do that?" Rather than just assume because they've got a probe there that they know what they're doing. So it's very important that the staff themselves know about E. coli. So how do you control outbreaks and how are they dealt with? Well, following an outbreak, notification to the Health Protection Agency and local authorities of possible or confirmed cases. The case questionnaire needs to be completed. Further cases may be identified, and then you'll have an outbreak control team being convened. Attempts to identify the source of infection using information using the questionnaires, and control measures will be put in place depending on the possible sources, i.e. product recall, prohibition notices, elimination of source, and possible prosecution of the premises involved. Individual sporadic cases are where there are no other cases notified, such as a single person has got E. coli. They will then be provided with advice for preventing spread in the home or the wider community, especially at risk groups and the young or the old. Excluding people from work, school, or nursery may be necessary, so particularly with food handlers. Clearance samples are required in the case of high-risk settings, for example, a hospital or a nursing home. And 2 negative stool samples, consecutive negative stool samples, are required before returning to work as a food handler. So, in summary, E. coli O157 H7 phage type 8 is a very dangerous organism. More than 1,000 cases are identified each year, but it's likely to be much more than this because of reporting, etc. It's more common than people think, particularly in raw beef and lamb. Outbreaks occur due to basic failures in controlling this organism, and other pathogenic serotypes are emerging. So control can be used by the following effective critical control points: adequate cooking, separation of raw and ready-to-eat foods, adequate processing, high standards of hygiene, and adequate cleaning and disinfection. So, for example, we said about beef burgers, but what about a shoulder of lamb that you're roasting? Well, you shouldn't serve a rolled joint raw. You should always have that cooked thoroughly with a core temperature of plus 75 degrees for 20 seconds. Anyone got any questions?
Might I comment?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I've not got a question, Steve.
Just
I'm not. I'm not going to apologise for not having a question. And I blooming thought for 35 minutes about what to ask you. I can't think of anything. I think that was an excellent presentation.
Yeah, well, I originally developed it a few years ago, and I've added to it since then. I mean, I've had a free fact sheet on Ecoli O157 for about the last 7 or 8 years, and I've done this presentation for various groups of people. I mean, it's about as comprehensive as I can get it. I apologise if it was a bit long and a bit sort of drawn out and boring, but it's what people need to know at the sharp end when they're having food. And a lot of managers haven't got the basic clue. They really don't understand how dangerous this organism is.
Well, what I'd like to say is we're not on this forum just to compliment each other. There's something more important to do here, which is I particularly take note of the way that you have given us a presentation which takes care to link the horrible microbiology thing that always throws people with the practical. And E. coli is a really good example of an organism that leads you to justify with food handlers and food workers why these controls are not just a load of rules that somebody's made up. They actually come out of the science. And I think sometimes, I'm thinking now as a trainer, I think sometimes we tempt ourselves to gloss over the microbiology because we feel it's so hard to explain. And it is a bit daunting. But if you take care to try and explain it in an interesting way like you have done, the rules and the controls suddenly become logical for people. And they go away saying, I know exactly why I've got to wash my hands this way, because he's almost shown me where the bacteria are, except I can't see them. So I appreciated that. I'm going to be cheeky. Can I have the presentation when you can put it into PowerPoint, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll transfer it back into PowerPoint.
Yeah, I know.
But basically, I mean, you need to put your own logo and whatever on it. And obviously, don't share this with the general public or produce a PDF, because some of the graphics on there are not copyright, and I don't want to get done for.
Well, you know that I know what you mean. I'm just saying, as a framework is what I'm after.
Yeah. Well, when I was first doing my level 4 back in 1989, which is 30 odd years ago now, 34 years ago, and I had to learn all these bacteria and the Latin names and all the rest of it. And one of the things I thought was that there was someone who worked at one of the universities in Leeds, and he always said, "Oh, well, this is E. coli, this, and that's Campylobacter, that, and that's this. Oh, and you'll know all that, won't you?" And of course, the people going on the course are actually working on the shop floor, and he didn't understand, because he was a microbiologist himself. He didn't understand that you need to break that stuff down into simple terms and steps and stages. And I've always prided myself on being able to get very complex ideas into simple levels, either by having, if we were doing this as a course, I'd be having you with the hand washing. I would do a practical session on hand washing. And I'd probably have a couple of chopping boards, one with raw meat on and one with a cooked sandwich on. And I've got something that, for example, you slice your raw meat with your red knife, and then I would steal a knife with a red knife. I'd go and pick the yellow knife up, and I'd steal it with the same steel. And then I would cut the sandwich up. And then I would get the salt and pepper pot, which I'd put on the raw meat, and I'd pick them up again and put it on the cooked sandwich. And you can't believe when people see you doing that. And, because I used to, when I was doing level 2 originally, over the last 20, 30 years, I would always have that. So I'd be stood there in my shirt and tie and say, right, can I start work now? And they'd look at me and say, well, no, you haven't got clothes on or whatever. Right. So I put all my clothes on and I say, right, can I start work now? And then one or two said, well, you haven't washed your hands. So I'd go and wash my hands. And then we would do this pantomime of the raw and the cooked and showing you how cross-contamination works. And it's showing people that even if you've got colour-coded stuff, that you need to have a bit of nous, a little bit, And I'm fortunate I'm able to do that because I worked on the shop floor. And I'm sure I've worked at a time before I did any food safety training where I've probably done something stupid as well. But that's going back to the 1970s when I was a combi chef. Anyone got anything else to add?
Yeah, you got two people with raised hands. So Duncan.
Oh, sorry, right, yeah. Malcolm.
Yeah, we start Duncan first. We'll go Duncan first.
All right, sorry, who's first? Where's that? Duncan, right.
Duncan.
Yeah,
Right.
just a wee anecdote about the two negative stool samples. There was an outbreak in Scotland related to blue cheese. I think it was about 5 years ago. And a chef in the hotel actually ended up eating some of the cheese and got E. coli. And it took over 2 months for him to get the two samples in a row. Because what was happening was he would get a negative one and then he would get a positive one. Because what happens with E. coli is it kind of goes into remission and then it builds up in the gut again, and then you can get enough to get a positive sample again. So he was going back and forward to the lab to get tests done, and it took him 2 months before he was allowed to work back with food again, because he worked in nursing homes and things like that. So obviously he had to be okay before he returned to work. So it's not necessarily a 48-hour or a 7-day thing. It can be quite an extended illness before you can return to high risk settings.
Oh, thank you, Duncan. Right, who else? Malcolm?
Malcolm. How would you monitor the staff procedures after the training course and actually suggest you revisit the training?
Well, that's where you get. I mean, people talk about training, and training, obviously, live training, especially, can be very expensive. I mean, I used to trade on quality, so I would be charging 800 to 1,000 quid for a level 4 course for one person. But that's because we used to keep the numbers low, and that paid my wage to do a week's course with only 4 students. It's it's a lot. But basically, one thing that I would say to a lot of chefs coming on, say, level 3, level 4 course, is the other way that you can keep food safety on the menu. So if you have regular team briefings, say if you have a weekly team briefing, you should always put something on either food safety, fire safety, health and safety, or whatever, and always view that. So, for example, when I ran a training centre in Leeds, we do food safety, although there wasn't a lot of food involved there. Then we do health and safety on things like maybe a session on slips, trips and falls. And then when we did the fire safety, I'd take them round and say, right, do you know where all the fire points are? Now, if you do that on a weekly basis, it sinks in and reinforces that message so that you've got a good culture of safety, and it's when, you just teach them in a classroom and they come back. I mean, I still remember head chefs saying to me when I was starting, oh, don't worry about that. You've learned, so you got a certificate. Just carry on as, and food safety has got to be a top-down approach. So if you can't get staff management on board, or your head chefs and your supervisors on board with setting a good standard, I would question why you would bother wanting to teach them. That's just my personal point of view. I would only teach people who I knew would carry out what I taught the staff. Because if I was, my reputation as well, if you got something wrong, so What's that?
Yeah.
Too much thoughts will be good to engage. Yeah. Right. Let's have a look. So, has anyone else got anything that they want to share?
A common one I'm asked when I'm out on site is about vacuum packers and the misconception that if you thoroughly clean a vacuum packer, you can use it for raw and cooked. From my own knowledge, I'm pretty sure the FSA pretty much say it has to be, it's a very specific word, it's almost like reconditioned. So it's almost taken apart by a trained engineer and then cleaned that way to then recommission it for ready to eat use if you've used it for raw. David's unmuted himself, so I'm guessing he's got something to put on this.
I'm
Yeah.
just keeping my puzzled face. I think they have had to say that if it's thoroughly cleaned and disinfected, it's okay. But at the same time, raise the question mark, which is, why would you be doing that? But I think you have to admit that if it's cleaned and disinfected, there's no reason why it shouldn't be used. You just know that in practice, if someone says this is my system, you just know you're heading towards a potential risk, but you can't very well say it's not allowed because it's not prevented from any legislation. It's just saying that really, are you really going to clean and disinfect it with an appropriate one? So I'm interested in what you mean by recommissioned, and I'd like you to, if you can find the reference, that would be useful, because I may have missed something.
I've definitely seen it before.
Okay.
Because
Yep.
it's a conversation that I have had with a practitioner before, and they did have a printed out copy of this very specific document. I don't know whether anyone else has come across it before.
Oh, Duncan, have you heard of it? Matthew, Malcolm, anybody heard of this?
No, I can put my oar in there in terms of we had somebody who had a massive problem through food poisoning with what's it called, a meat slicer in a butcher's.
Yeah.
And that caused absolute bedlam chaos. That was a while ago. And they were basically told that, again, they were using the machine for basically both raw, believe it or not, but their defense was they would do the raw before the butcher's opened, and they would do the coop when it was open, the shop was opened, but the food poisoned a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that if you think about it, things like packing machines and slicers and whatever aren't, in the overall scheme of things, that expensive. So why wouldn't you have two of everything? You know, it makes sense, because it's when you think about what can go wrong and how people can be injured.
Yeah.
You know, and the fines involved.
Sorry, I lost you there. Sorry.
So, I mean, I've got one example. When I was assistant catering manager at Broadgate Hospital back in the 80s, I looked at them cleaning a slicer. And what they did was they got a knife on the blade, turned it on, and scraped all the fat off. Then they got a mucky dishcloth and wiped the remainder of the residue. They'd take the hopper off and put that through the dishwashing machine, and that was about it. And I showed them how to clean and disinfect the slicing machine, which we only ever use for cooked meat, to be honest. And basically, the way to do it is, first of all, you disconnect the electric from the machine, turn it off. You then take the hopper off on a gravity-fed slicer, and then you take the knife sharpener off the top, and then the blade guard. You then put the blade guard back on and take the 4 screws or whatever out, depending on the model, and then put that blade through the dishwash. You would then take the heel of the plate off and then begin to wash everything off. Now, in this particular instance, they had never properly stripped down this meat slicer. And Roger, my head chef, I was showing him how to do this. And we took the heel off the plate, and there was a gap in the actual bottom where he took the 2 screws off. Guess what was inside that gap? Maggots.
Oh, God.
And he nearly threw up on site, did Roger. And I said, that's why you have to strip it down. And then what we did was we did a training of people how to use the slicer. And I would show them and do it one at a time. And I would show them how to do it stage by stage, strip it down, break it down into easy stages. And then I would reassemble and test it. Then I would get them under my supervision to do it. And once they'd done that, I would then sign them off, and I'd put a notice up on top of the wall behind the slicer. Only the following people are authorised to use this machine. It didn't turn out as I expected, because one Sunday I was on call and one of the chefs rang me up and said, Steve, you'll never guess what's happened. And I said, what? And she turned around to me and said, Len's cut his thumb in the slicer. And it was a Sunday. So I got there on the Monday, and Len had been known to trap he put his hand in a 60-quart mixer and bruised the back of his hand. So it was a bit of you won't employ a guy like that these days because they're going to be competent. And basically, I saw him outside my office and I said, right, come in. Said, right then, what did you do? And he got his thumb all bandaged up and whatever. And I said, what did you do? He said, well, I was changing the lamb over from one joint to another. And I said, did you turn the machine off? Like I told you so. He says, no, I didn't. So basically, what's the word? I got him to write down a statement to say he hadn't followed instructions, because without that, it would have been my fault to training him. But that's just, it's the way it is.
I've found the reference to the recommissioning of vacuum packers from the FSA, and this is advice exclusively for vacuum packers as opposed to any other complex equipment. And reading it briefly, it basically says what you said, Brendan, that as vacuum packers are engineered equipment and not simply things that you can dismantle, because they include the vacuum pump, etc., that they need to be dismantled, ready for cleaning and disinfecting by somebody who's qualified to do that. So when they say recommissioning, what they mean is dismantling, cleaning and disinfecting. But they're just saying that if you can't do all that, completely strip it down to disinfect it, then you cannot use a vacuum packer for raw and cooked.
Well, I had the same excuse from the engineer on the Broadgate site, Kevin Hartley, and he was the chief engineer. And I said, can you send me an Allen screw to take the blade off? He says, no. He says, I can't let you do that. He says, I'll have to send a bloke down. I said, well, can you just arrange for him to come down about 5-6 times a day? You're going to clean it down between its use. And he said, I says, what do you mean? And I explained it. I said, look, I can train these staff to do this properly, provided they're under supervision and etc. Apart from, obviously, the guy, Len, who was a bit accident prone and didn't follow the instructions. And, well, that's another story.
Yeah, it's under Ecoli cross-contamination guidance from the Food Standards Agency. There's a link to the PDF on there about decommissioning of vacuum packers specifically, and that was last updated 31st of December 2020. So it's reasonably current.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants the shortcut, Matthew has actually already found it and posted it on the chat.
Oh, well done, Matthew. Thank you. I'm glad somebody could. I couldn't work out how to post it in time.
Well, I'm calling it 8 o'clock, guys.
Yeah. Anyone got anything else before we close this session? Anything new? Well, in that case,
rather a quiet year so far.
Yeah.
Hopefully it stays
Brilliant.
quiet for the rest of the year.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheers.
you.